They called me crazy for buying that rundown hangar for $3,000. Chuck Brennigan, my supervisor at Mesa Aviation, actually laughed so hard he nearly choked on his coffee when I told him. "Zelda, you just threw away your life savings on a pile of rust," he said, shaking his head like I was some naive kid who'd never seen the inside of an aircraft engine. But here's what Chuck and everyone else who mocked me didn't know. The previous owner wasn't just some random guy trying to unload a worthless property. Fletcher Drummond was a 74-year-old Air Force veteran who had spent the last 40 years of his life carefully, methodically, secretly preparing for someone exactly like me to find what he'd hidden inside those rusted walls. My name is Zelda Martinez, and I'm 28 years old. For the past 12 years, I've been working as an aircraft mechanic in Phoenix, Arizona, fixing other people's planes and dreaming about the day I could start my own restoration business. My grandfather Hector taught me everything about engines when I was just 8 years old, back when he was still sharp enough to remember his days working on military aircraft during the Korean War. He used to tell me that the best mechanics don't just fix what's broken, they understand what makes something fly. Every morning for 12 years, I've walked into hangars and workshops where grown men would stop talking when I entered, where customers would ask if there was a real mechanic available to look at their planes, where my knowledge was constantly questioned simply because I happened to be born female. I've had to prove myself over and over again, fixing problems that stumped mechanics with twice my experience, only to watch them get the credit and the respect that should have been mine. The day I signed the papers for that hangar, I was terrified and exhilarated at the same time. $3,000 represented every penny I'd managed to save, plus a loan from my brother Diego that he could barely afford to give me. The real estate agent, Mrs. Cordelia Blackwood, kept apologizing for the condition of the property, explaining that Mr. Drummond had been very specific about who could purchase it, though she never explained what those specifications were. Standing outside that hangar for the first time as its owner, looking at the rust-stained metal siding and the weeds growing through cracks in the concrete, I felt like I was staring at either my future or my financial ruin. The main doors groaned and shrieked when I tried to open them, the sound echoing across the empty lot like some kind of warning. Inside, broken glass crunched under my boots, and spiderwebs hung from the ceiling like abandoned dreams. Chuck had followed me there that first day, arms crossed, that familiar smirk on his face. 3 months, he announced to the other mechanics who had tagged along to witness what they expected to be my public failure. I give her 3 months before she comes crawling back, begging us to buy this junk pile for scrap metal prices. What none of them realized was that Fletcher Drummond had been watching our aviation community for years, waiting for someone who shared his passion and understood his struggles. He had deliberately structured the sale to ensure his life's work would go to someone who deserved it, someone who had faced the same skepticism and doubt that he remembered from his own early days in aviation. When I found what Fletcher had left behind, hidden beneath false floors and concealed behind walls that looked like ordinary storage, those same people who had mocked my purchase couldn't believe their eyes. Chuck's arrogant laughter turned into stunned silence. The worthless hangar they had all dismissed became the foundation of something extraordinary, something that would change not just my life, but their entire understanding of what's possible when someone believes in your potential even before they meet you. Growing up in my grandfather Hector's garage was like living inside a history book filled with the smell of motor oil and stories of aircraft that had touched the clouds over Korea. Every Saturday morning I'd wake up to the sound of his ancient radio playing oldies while he worked on some neighbor's car or tinkered with model airplane engines he'd build from scratch. His hands were permanently stained with grease, but they moved with the precision of a surgeon when he explained how a carburetor worked or why a particular bolt had to be tightened to exactly 23 foot-pounds of torque. Hector never talked much about the war itself, but he'd light up when describing the P-51 Mustangs and B-25 Mitchells he'd worked on at the airfield outside Seoul. "Zelda, these machines weren't just metal and bolts," he'd say, his weathered fingers tracing the outline of a wing design he'd sketched on a napkin. "They were the difference between boys coming home to their families or not. Every repair mattered. Every inspection could save a life." When he passed away during my junior year of high school, I thought I'd lost the only person who truly understood my fascination with engines and my dream of working on aircraft. My parents, Elena and Roberto, were supportive but practical. They wanted me to pursue something more stable than aviation mechanics. My mother would say, "Mija, you're so smart. Why not become an engineer where you can design planes instead of just fixing them?" But I knew I belonged in the hangars, not the offices. There's something magical about diagnosing engine problems by sound, about feeling the vibration that tells you exactly which bearing is wearing out, about the satisfaction of turning a wrench and knowing that your work will keep someone safe in the sky. For 12 years after graduation, I'd been chasing that magic while fighting an uphill battle for respect in every shop where I worked. At Mesa Aviation, I'd proven myself countless times. I was the one who figured out why that Cessna 172 was losing power during takeoff when 3 other mechanics had given up. I diagnosed the intermittent electrical problem in the corporate jet that had been grounded for 2 weeks. I could strip and rebuild a Lycoming engine faster than anyone in the shop, but customers still asked Chuck if there was a real mechanic available. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning when a pilot named Gerald Morrison refused to let me inspect his Piper Cherokee because, as he put it, "Sweetheart, I don't trust my life to someone who probably learned about engines from YouTube videos." Chuck just shrugged and assigned the inspection to Tommy Rodriguez, who had half my experience but twice my chromosome count, apparently making him more qualified in Morrison's eyes. That afternoon, I was scrolling through aircraft hangar listings online, not really expecting to find anything I could afford, when I saw the listing for Fletcher Drummond's property. $3,000 for a hangar on the outskirts of Phoenix seemed too good to be true, which usually means it is. But something about the faded photograph of that weathered building spoke to me the same way Hector's stories had when I was 8 years old. Mrs. Cordelia Blackwood met me at the property on a Thursday evening, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the desert wind whipping across the empty lot. She seemed genuinely sorry about the condition of the hangar, explaining that Mr. Drummond had been very particular about maintenance during his lifetime, but had been unable to keep up with repairs during his final years. He was quite specific about the sale, she said, fumbling with a ring of old keys. Fletcher insisted that if anyone inquired about purchasing the property for aircraft restoration purposes, they should be given first consideration regardless of other offers. The hangar looked even worse in person than in the photographs. Rust had eaten holes through sections of the metal siding, and several windows had been boarded up with plywood that was now warping and pulling away from the frames. When Mrs. Blackwood finally managed to slide open the main doors, they screeched like wounded animals, the sound echoing across the desert landscape. Inside, the concrete floor was cracked and stained with decades of oil and hydraulic fluid. Weeds had somehow found their way through the fissures, creating small patches of green in the otherwise gray and brown landscape of abandonment. The overhead fluorescent fixtures hung at odd angles, and most of the bulbs had long since burned out or been broken. But standing in that empty space, breathing air that still carried the faint scent of aviation fuel and hearing the wind whistle, through the gaps in the walls I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: hope. The mockery started before I'd even signed the final paperwork. Word travels fast in aviation circles, especially when it's gossip about someone making what everyone considers a spectacular mistake. Chuck Brannigan couldn't contain his amusement. When I told him about my purchase during our Monday morning briefing, he actually slapped his knee and said, $3,000 for that rust bucket? Zelda, you could have bought a decent used car instead of chasing some fantasy about running your own shop. But Chuck wasn't content to keep his opinions private. By Wednesday, half the mechanics at Mesa Aviation had heard his colorful commentary about my financial suicide, and they were all eager to add their own predictions about my inevitable failure. Tommy Rodriguez, who still couldn't properly gap spark plugs after 2 years on the job, shook his head in mock sympathy. I hate to see good money wasted like that. You should have asked us before making such a big decision. The harassment escalated when Jake Peterson, one of the senior mechanics, started taking bets on how long I'd last before coming crawling back begging for my old job. $5 minimum, with the pool growing larger each day as more people joined in. Jake posted a handwritten chart on the break room wall titled Zelda's Countdown to Reality, with categories ranging from 2 weeks to 6 months if she's really stubborn. What hurt worse than their laughter was watching customers start to question whether they wanted me working on their aircraft. Gerald Morrison, the same pilot who'd refused my services before, made a point of telling Chuck within my earshot, "I'm not sure I'm comfortable having someone with such poor judgment working on my plane. If she can't make smart decisions about property, how can I trust her with my engine?" Chuck, seeing an opportunity to solidify his authority and maybe push me out entirely, started assigning me to the least desirable jobs while giving the interesting restoration projects to other mechanics. "Zelda's got enough on her plate with her new business venture," he'd announce whenever a challenging repair came through the door. "Let's let Tommy handle this Mustang restoration." The financial pressure hit harder than I'd anticipated. My initial $3,000 investment was just the beginning of my problems. The electrical system needed to be completely replaced because decades of desert heat had turned the wiring into brittle, cracked hazards waiting to start fires. The roof had multiple leaks that had allowed water damage to spread throughout the interior support beams, requiring structural repairs I hadn't budgeted for. Even with my brother Diego offering to help with labor at no charge, the material costs alone were looking at $15,000 minimum. My hours at Mesa Aviation got cut to part-time as Chuck claimed business was slow, though I noticed he wasn't reducing anyone else's schedule. 24 hours a week wasn't enough to cover both my living expenses and the mounting renovation costs. I started eating ramen noodles for dinner and skipping lunch entirely, telling myself it was temporary, that everything would work out once I got the business running. The worst part was the doubt creeping into my own mind. Sitting alone in that empty hangar on a particularly difficult evening, surrounded by broken glass and water stains and the overwhelming smell of rust and decay, I wondered if everyone had been right about my foolish dream. The silence was deafening, except for the wind whistling through gaps in the walls, making the whole structure creak like it might collapse at any moment. I called my mother that night, fighting back tears as I described the mounting problems and dwindling bank account. Elena listened patiently before reminding me of something Hector used to say. "The best mechanics aren't the ones who never face problems, mija. They're the ones who find solutions nobody else sees." But even my mother's encouragement couldn't silence Chuck's final insult, delivered in front of 6 mechanics and 4 customers on a busy Friday afternoon. He looked around the shop with theatrical confidence and announced, "I'm making this official. 3 months from today, I'll personally write Zelda a check for $2,000 when she begs us to take that junk pile off her hands for scrap metal prices. Anyone want to witness this generous offer?" The laughter that followed felt like a physical blow, but it also ignited something inside me that I'd inherited from my grandfather. Hector had faced skepticism about his abilities during the war, proving himself one repair at a time, until even the pilots who initially doubted him trusted their lives to his work. Chuck's public bet was the last straw. Walking out of Mesa Aviation that Friday afternoon, I made a decision that terrified and exhilarated me in equal measure. Instead of letting their mockery crush my spirit, I was going to use it as fuel. I called Chuck from my truck before I'd even left the parking lot and told him I quit, effective immediately. No 2 weeks notice, no gradual transition. I was done being their source of entertainment. "You're making a huge mistake, Zelda," Chuck said, though I could hear the surprise in his voice. "Don't let pride ruin your career. You can still back out of this hangar nonsense and keep your job." "The only mistake I made was waiting this long to leave," I replied, hanging up before he could respond. That weekend, Diego came over to help me move the basic tools I'd need to start working full-time on the hangar restoration. He'd been watching the situation at Mesa Aviation with growing anger, and seeing me finally take control seemed to energize him too. "It's about time you told those idiots where they could stick their opinions," he said, loading my toolbox into his pickup truck. The first week working alone in the hangar was simultaneously the most peaceful and most challenging of my career. Without the constant background noise of doubt and harassment, I could finally think clearly about what needed to be done. I started with the electrical system, spending long days rewiring circuits and installing new breaker panels. The physical work felt therapeutic, like I was rebuilding myself along with the building. But it was during my second week that everything changed. I was cleaning debris from the far corner of the hangar, where years of neglect had allowed trash and broken equipment to accumulate into small mountains of rust and decay. Diego was helping me haul out a particularly heavy piece of old machinery when we heard it. A hollow sound beneath our feet that didn't match the solid concrete everywhere else. "Did you hear that?" Diego asked, stopping mid-step and stomping his boot against the floor. The sound came again, definitely hollow, like there was empty space beneath us. We spent the next 2 hours carefully removing debris and examining the floor until we found what we were looking for. Several concrete panels in the corner weren't actually part of the original foundation. They were carefully fitted covers, designed to look permanent, but actually removable. Diego went to his truck for a crowbar while I cleared away the remaining trash. The panels lifted easier than expected, revealing a set of concrete steps leading down into darkness. Diego grabbed the flashlight from his glove compartment and we descended into what appeared to be an underground workshop that had been completely hidden from view. The air smelled like old leather and motor oil, but in a pleasant way, like a garage that had been loved and cared for over many years. The space was larger than my entire apartment, with workbenches along 3 walls and shelving units reaching from floor to ceiling. Every surface was covered with aircraft parts, tools, and equipment that had been carefully organized and preserved. Vintage propellers hung from the ceiling like metallic sculptures, and dozens of wooden crates lined the walls, each one labeled with meticulous handwriting. "Zelda, look at this stuff," Diego whispered, his voice filled with awe as he examined a pristine radial engine mounted on a restoration stand. "This is all original Budgetude equipment. Some of this stuff belongs in museums. But what caught my attention was the metal filing cabinet in the corner, secured with a heavy-duty combination lock, and the sealed envelope taped to its front. The envelope was addressed in careful cursive handwriting. "To whoever finds this, my..." Hands were shaking as I opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. It was dated just 8 months ago, written in the same precise handwriting as the labels on the storage crates. "My name is Fletcher Drummond," the letter began. "If you're reading this, it means you've discovered what I've spent the last 40 years of my life collecting and preserving. I have no family to leave this to, so I'm trusting that whoever finds my life's work will understand its value and treat it with the respect it deserves." The letter went on to explain that Fletcher had been collecting rare aircraft parts and restoration materials since his retirement from the Air Force in 1982. He'd built the underground workshop himself, designing it to preserve everything in perfect condition for whoever came next. The combination to the filing cabinet was included at the bottom of the page, along with one final instruction that made my heart race. "Check the rear wall behind the false shelving unit for my most precious gift to aviation's future." The filing cabinet opened with a satisfying click, revealing blueprints and documentation that made my breath catch in my throat. Detailed restoration records for a 1943 North American P-51D Mustang, complete with original factory specifications, maintenance logs dating back 60 years, and photographs showing every stage of what appeared to be a meticulous professional restoration. But it was the hand-drawn map tucked between the blueprints that stopped me cold. The diagram showed the exact layout of the hangar above us, with one section marked in red ink and labeled Emergency Access, Hydraulic Release System. Diego leaned over my shoulder as I traced the lines with my finger, trying to understand what Fletcher had been trying to tell us. "Look at this," I said, pointing to a series of numbered instructions written in Fletcher's careful handwriting. "Step 1. Locate the electrical panel behind the false wall. Step 2. Flip switches marked Alpha, Bravo, Charlie in sequence. Step 3. Press and hold the red emergency button for 10 seconds. We climbed back up to the main hangar, following the map to what looked like an ordinary shelving unit against the rear wall. But when Diego pulled away the first shelf, we found it was mounted on hinges, revealing an electrical panel exactly where Fletcher's diagram said it would be. The switches were labeled with small metal tags, and the red emergency button sat in the center like something from a military command center. My heart was pounding as I followed Fletcher's instructions. Alpha switch up, Bravo switch up, Charlie switch up. I looked at Diego, took a deep breath, and pressed the red button. The sound that followed was unlike anything I'd ever heard in a hangar. Deep mechanical grinding mixed with hydraulic hissing, like some enormous machine awakening after decades of sleep. The rear wall began to split down the middle, revealing that what I'd assumed was solid concrete was actually two massive panels designed to slide apart. As the wall opened, overhead lights automatically illuminated the space beyond, and I felt my knees go weak. There, sitting in a climate-controlled chamber like a shrine to aviation history, was the most beautiful aircraft I'd ever seen. The P-51 Mustang gleamed under the lights, its silver skin polished to mirror perfection. The red and yellow nose art as vibrant as the day it was painted. Even from 30 feet away, I could tell this wasn't just a restored airplane. This was a masterpiece. "Holy hell, Zelda," Diego whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat. "That thing looks like it just rolled off the assembly line." We approached the aircraft like pilgrims entering a cathedral. Every rivet was perfect, every surface immaculate. The canopy was crystal clear, the propeller blades gleaming like polished swords. A small placard mounted near the nose gear read, "Captain James T. Drummond, 352nd Fighter Squadron, 1943-1945. But it was the second letter, sealed in a waterproof pouch attached to the pilot's seat, that revealed Fletcher's true intention. This letter was longer, more personal, and as I read it aloud to Diego, I felt like Fletcher was speaking directly to me across the years. This aircraft belonged to my father, Captain James Drummond, who flew 37 combat missions over Europe before the war ended. Dad recovered the plane in 1967 from a military surplus yard where it had been rotting for 20 years. He spent the next 15 years of his life restoring it to perfect condition, and when he passed in 1982, I promised him I'd continue his work. The letter explained that Fletcher had spent 40 years maintaining the aircraft, running the engine, monthly preserving every system, waiting for someone worthy to inherit his father's legacy. But the most shocking revelation came in the final paragraph. "I've been watching your aviation community for years, waiting for someone who understands what it means to face doubt and skepticism while pursuing their passion." Mrs. Blackwood had specific instructions to contact any female mechanic who inquired about aircraft restoration, because I believe women in aviation deserve the support I wish I'd had when I started out. At that moment, we heard voices outside the hangar. Chuck's unmistakable laugh mixed with Tommy Rodriguez and Jake Peterson, along with several others I recognized from Mesa Aviation. They'd come to witness what they expected to be my surrender, ready to gloat over my failure, and maybe negotiate that scrap metal price Chuck had joked about. Instead, they walked through the main doors to find me standing next to a pristine P-51 Mustang in a climate-controlled chamber that looked like something from an aviation museum. The laughter stopped instantly, replaced by absolute silence as they stared at Fletcher's incredible gift. Chuck's face went through several expressions before settling on something resembling shock. "I had no idea Fletcher had anything like this. That Mustang alone is worth more than my house." "Fletcher knew exactly what he was doing," I replied, my voice steady and confident for the first time in months. "He was waiting for someone who would appreciate not just the value, but the legacy." The news about Fletcher's incredible gift spread through the aviation community faster than wildfire. Within 48 hours, my phone was ringing non-stop with calls from collectors, museum curators, and aviation enthusiasts from across the country who had heard about the perfectly preserved P-51 Mustang and the underground treasure trove of vintage parts. Word had gotten out through social media posts from some of the mechanics who witnessed that day, and suddenly everyone wanted to visit Fletcher's Legacy Aviation, the name I chose for my new business. The first serious inquiry came from the Commemorative Air Force, an organization dedicated to preserving W-2 aircraft. Their regional director, Colonel Patricia Williams, drove down from Flagstaff personally to examine the Mustang and discuss a potential partnership. Standing in that climate-controlled chamber, watching her run her hands along the aircraft's pristine fuselage, I realized that Fletcher's gift wasn't just about proving my worth to local doubters. He'd connected me to an entire network of people who understood the true value of preserving aviation history. "This is museum-quality restoration work," Colonel Williams said, examining the engine cowling with obvious admiration. Fletcher Drummond was one of the finest aircraft restorers in the country, though he always worked quietly, never seeking recognition. The fact that he chose you to continue his work says everything about your potential. Within 2 months, I had more restoration projects than I could handle. The vintage parts collection allowed me to specialize in warbird restorations, something most shops couldn't do because original components were nearly impossible to find. Diego quit his job at the auto shop to join me full-time, and we hired 2 additional mechanics, including Rebecca Chen, a recent aviation maintenance school graduate who had been facing the same gender discrimination I'd experienced for years. The transformation in my relationship with the local aviation community was remarkable. Gerald Morrison, the pilot who had once questioned my competence, became one of my most vocal advocates after I restored the original instruments in his 1945 Stearman using parts from Fletcher's collection. Even some of the mechanics from Mesa Aviation started referring customers to my shop, though they did so quietly, probably embarrassed about their previous behavior. Chuck's attitude changed most dramatically of all. 6 months after that confrontational day in the hangar, he showed up at my shop, hat in hand, asking if I had any openings for experienced mechanics. His arrogance had been replaced by something resembling humility, and he admitted that watching me succeed had forced him to examine his own prejudices. "I was wrong about you, Zelda," he said, standing awkwardly in my office while the sounds of aircraft restoration filled the air around us. "I was wrong about a lot of things. Would you consider giving me a chance to prove I can change?" I hired Chuck at entry-level wages with the understanding that respect had to be earned, not demanded. Watching him work alongside Rebecca, teaching her advanced techniques while learning from her fresh perspective on modern avionics, reminded me of Fletcher's belief that everyone deserves an opportunity to grow beyond their mistakes. The P-51 Mustang became the centerpiece of my shop, but more than that, it became a symbol of what's possible when someone believes in your potential before you even meet them. I kept Fletcher's father's aircraft airworthy, flying it in air shows across the Southwest to honor both their memories. Every time I taxi that magnificent machine onto a runway, I think about Hector's words about mechanics being the difference between pilots coming home safely or not. A year after discovering Fletcher's underground workshop, I established a scholarship fund for women pursuing careers in aviation maintenance. The fund is supported by profits from the restoration business and by donations from people who visit the shop and hear Fletcher's story. Rebecca was our first recipient, and watching her confidence grow as she masters complex restoration techniques reminds me why Fletcher chose to invest in someone who understood struggle. Standing in my fully operational hangar today, surrounded by the sounds of radial engines and the smell of aviation fuel, I'm reminded that worth isn't determined by other people's expectations, but by the courage to pursue your passion despite their doubts. Fletcher Drummond saw something in me that I was still learning to see in myself, proving that sometimes the most important support comes from someone who understands your journey because they've walked a similar path. If this story inspired you to believe in your own potential, despite what others might say, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about people who found their strength in unexpected places. Your support helps me share these important messages about perseverance, courage, and the power of someone believing in you when you need it most.